this November when we go to the polls. No, in this election and every election is about who will have the power to shape our children for the next 4 or 8 years of their lives.
Welcome to Manny's Live, this new iteration of what we're doing here at Manny's in San Francisco. My name is Manny Yakutiel, and I'm the owner of this incredible small business that we've all called our home, Manny's, here on the corner of 16th and Valencia. So I want to welcome you to the first ever episode of our new show called Manny's Live, where we bring people together to talk about the important issues, ask the tough questions, and create some community. So thank you everyone for tuning in. I really appreciate it. And I just want to set the stage for what's going to happen today. These are tough and tension-filled times. The tension is thick, even in the air here, but we're going to break it down, but also in people's living rooms and in their homes. People are having hard conversations right now, and it's our goal tonight to actually get to some of these answers, be together, and actually be willing to cut some of that tension and create a path forward. Before we do start, I want to acknowledge two things, because acknowledgements are important. First, I want to acknowledge the land that we're on. This is Ohlone land, and it's important that we acknowledge that the land that we're on right now having this conversation was taken. And so I want to acknowledge the Ohlone people and thank them. And second, words matter. And we've talked a lot about words, and we're going to talk about words in this conversation. And it's important to say out loud at the beginning of this conversation that Black lives matter and Black trans lives matter deeply. And so we're going to get into that, but before we do that, we have a little video for you.
Today on Manny's Live.
The death of George Floyd ignited what might be some of the largest and most powerful protests in recent memory, as well as tensions between the public and the police. DA Boudin has called for numerous police reforms focused on accountability. Chief Scott has condemned the assault on Black bodies. How has and how can the District Attorney's Office and the Police Department be a part of the movement to protect Black lives? How will the two of the leaders of law enforcement in the city work to make San Francisco proud? What are the solutions and how do we get there? What's the path forward?
All right. Thank you so much. And here we are. I'm here with the District Attorney of San Francisco, Chesa Boudin, and the Chief of Police of San Francisco, Chief Bill Scott. Thank you both so much for coming to Manny's tonight. How you doing?
Doing well. Thanks for having us, Manny.
Of course. How are those masks? Are they fitting okay?
They're doing all right. I miss the days when we could be in this space full of people with no masks and shoulder to shoulder, sharing drinks, sharing ideas, and I hope those days come back soon.
I see you've outdone Chief Scott now. You've got a much more stylish mask than the two of us. We have to up our mask game, definitely. So tonight's conversation obviously is about the path forward. And I wanted to start this conversation by grounding us in the personal, right? And I wanted to ask both of you how you're doing in this moment. How's your heart? How are you feeling? And kind of where are you right now in your kind of emotional and spiritual journey with all this? Let's start with you, Chief Scott.
Well, my heart is heavy. And this incident with the death and killing of Mr. Floyd, I think, for me, transcends anything that I've seen in my 30 plus years in policing. And it's not that there have been deaths before and there have been unjustified killings before, but this is different. And, me personally, I think, while my heart is heavy, I think it really brings opportunity for real change. Mm-hmm. And I'm optimistic about that part of it. And for me, I think it's time. It's time for change, real change to occur.
Yeah, I'm so glad to hear you say that. And I'm so excited to also hear from you kind of how we can work together to make that happen. So thank you for that, Chief Scott. All right, Chesa, District Attorney of San Francisco. How you doing? I haven't seen you. I haven't seen that gorgeous punum of yours. How are you feeling? Where's your heart right now?
I wish you could see the face right now because I'm smiling. I'm happy to be here with you. But like Chief Scott, my heart is heavy, and I think, as he said, the killing of George Floyd was in some ways not new or unique. We have had people, especially Black men, killed by law enforcement in this country for hundreds of years. So in some ways, there's nothing new or different or even surprising about what happened to him. But I think it weighs on all of our hearts, and I think it weighs on all of our consciousness in a way that many other killings at the hands of the state do not, for a few reasons. And one is most recent killings where civilians have been killed by police have involved guns,
Right.
have involved people being shot. And there's something much less personal and much less even violent in an odd way about gunfire. We're numb to it because of war and because of video games.
Right.
But the killing of George Floyd, which happened over nearly 9 agonizing minutes, and which was documented in vivid detail by a video camera that captured not just the act, but also the indifference to the act and to the fact that the act was being documented.
Right.
And it happened in a way that, using body weight, using flesh on flesh, that's more invasive and intimate and horrific than even a similar taking of life if done with a firearm.
I just watched the video, actually, myself. I have kind of an issue watching violence. I saw a lot of violence growing up in Los Angeles, where I grew up, and it kind of really traumatized me. And so I've kind of refused to watch the video until actually today. And you're right, there's something about the flesh on flesh that makes it seem even more cruel. And I probably shouldn't have watched it right before this, but I felt like I had to see it if I was going to have this conversation. Okay, so as much as I want to talk about San Francisco, and San Franciscans love to talk about ourselves, I think it's important for us to couch this nationally as well, because San Francisco sees itself as a leader, and you are both leaders of our law enforcement here. So we're going to talk about San Francisco a little bit, but I also want to talk about what you think about what's going on in the country. So Chief Scott, you are an African-American police chief in a city that only has 5 to 6% of its population identifying as African-American. You grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. You were a police officer during the Rodney King riots. And now you are our police chief in the middle of what some are saying is the greatest period of civil unrest since the 60s. So I want to ask you what you see as your role right now nationally. What do you think you represent with this movement, and how do you see yourself, how do you see your role right now with everything that's going on?
Well, I think my role is to show and be a leader, to show leadership and be a leader. And in doing that, you know, my background and my experience, and I'm sure the district attorney can speak similarly, brings the perspective of a black man in America. And, you know, I am who I am based on my experiences and how I was raised. And, you know, Birmingham, Alabama, we moved back there in 1970 when my father, who was in the military, was killed. We moved back into a very segregated and racist place. And so to see that growing up, to have the experiences of, you know, we moved into a white neighborhood in 1970, and we were, I believe, the first African-American family on that block. And to see, literally, to see, and I remember this vividly, overnight for sale signs up and down the block. I didn't know what it meant then, but as I got older, I knew what it meant. You know, those things are still rooted in my experiences, understanding really the gravity of racism and how it can impact not only society, but just impact the individuals who suffer at the hands of racism. So that perspective and many more things that were part of my growth in childhood, I think give me a perspective that right now needs to be at the table. And it's really important. You know, we're a country of diversity. In our past, we haven't always had diverse perspectives at the table.
Right.
Now more than ever, they're needed. So leadership, bringing the leadership, the willingness, number one, to acknowledge, I mean, to my point and the district attorney's point, we have a history in this country that cannot be overlooked, cannot be made to go away. We have a history in this country of policing black men, particularly in disparate ways, whether it be killings, whether it be disparate disparities in the penal system, you name it. It's been there and it continues to happen. So, this is, I think, the energy that people seeing the shocking death of Mr. Floyd have finally said, we have to change the narrative right now. And I'm glad to get an opportunity to be a part of that change and be in a leadership position to bring my perspective to the table.
And you see yourself as a reformer. I mean, you've talked about wanting to make changes. You talked about changes you wanted to make when you first became police chief. I want to ask you, how can Chesa, as district attorney, help you with the reforms that you want to make?
Well, I mean, the district attorney has a platform of reform. And change is not easy. If it was easy, I think a lot of change would have happened by now.
We're going to talk about that.
Okay. But he brings a perspective, and sometimes, and I must admit, when change is bold and courageous, sometimes it takes time to process it. And he has pushed the envelope walking through the door, and that's a good thing. It's not easy, and he will tell you he and I don't always agree, but I think we want to get to the same place. So really, as professionals and as leaders, the question is, how do we work through our differences to get to that place that we both want to get to, which is change in all the things that both of us are speaking of.
Okay, you're off the hot seat for a second. Now we're going to go to Chesa, the district attorney. So you are probably one of the most famous district attorneys in the country. I don't know a lot of district attorneys that had Bernie Sanders endorsing them, Sonia Sotomayor at your inauguration, my personal shiro. And also you have an amazing personal story. Your parents, of course, were imprisoned. Your father is still in prison, I believe. What do you see as your role, right? Beyond just reforming San Francisco and its laws and its rules and its prosecution, what do you see as your role as a district attorney right now amongst all that's happening?
Well, I think I just heard the chief call my platform bold and courageous.
Yeah.
I'm gonna take that. I'm gonna run with it. No, but I think it's right. I mean, regardless of whether that was a comment aimed at me in particular, I think we need to recognize that these are extraordinary times, and we are watching something that's really unprecedented in this country's history in so many ways. And I don't think it's a new movement, but I think it's a resurgence of a centuries-old movement that's been around since the time that Harriet Tubman was helping slaves escape, and since the time that Nat Turner was rising up in rebellion, and since the time that you name it, Jim Crow, abolitionists. We have seen a movement against white supremacy, against police brutality that has existed in this country since this country's founding. And yet, never has it been this broad, this mainstream, this peaceful, this engaged on a national level. And I think, as Chief Scott said in the beginning, I think this is a real opportunity for all of us. And I feel lucky to be at the table, not just at this table with both of you, but
the
at
sequin table. Can people see? Oh, people can't see the sequin.
It's a beautiful sequin table.
Thank you.
You're missing out if you're not seeing it.
Someday in the future.
But joking aside, we are in leadership positions.
Yeah.
I know we're both proud to serve the city. I know we're both honored to have the opportunity to serve and to lead. And as difficult as these times are, between COVID and the economic crisis and now this national social uprising, it's moments like this that really create opportunity for change and that create opportunity for leadership. So I'm just working hard every day to try to fulfill the promises I made, to try to realize the potential of this tremendous energy, and to try to make San Francisco safer for everybody who lives here.
So how can this man right here, who is the chief of police, help you actually enact the reforms that are so bold and so courageous, as he says?
The police department and the district attorney's office in every jurisdiction in the country have to work closely together. And there's some things that are unique about San Francisco because we really have just one police department because it's the city and county of San Francisco. Most places, you go to LA, for example, the LA district attorney's office is working on a daily basis with dozens of different law enforcement agencies. In San Francisco, it's pretty much us. We're pretty much in this together for better or worse. And that means we have to work together, and we have to find ways to work together. We have different jobs and different mandates, but they both fundamentally focus on public safety and equal enforcement of the law.
Got it.
And so as Chief Scott said, we will often disagree, But the challenge for us is to continue, as we have done since day one, communicating with each other, finding common ground, and pushing each other, I think, in ways that we're capable of doing that. I'll give you a concrete example.
Love it.
Before Chief Scott took office as chief in San Francisco, the Obama Department of Justice began an investigation into the San Francisco Police Department. And in its report in 2016, it listed, I think, 272 reforms that the Department of Justice believed the San Francisco Police Department had to make in order to address deep-seated racism and racial disparities in policing. That's not Chief Scott's problem. I mean, it predates him.
Right.
Those are problems that predate him. He was brought in many ways to address those problems. And yet, he runs a very big agency. There are in any bureaucracy, in any government agency, in any police department in the country, deeply entrenched problems that aren't going to just be changed overnight. As Chief Scott said, change is hard, or it would have already happened. And so I like to think that one of the ways we can work together is that I can push him and push his department to make some of the changes that we know they need to make, that have been documented for years, and that, for whatever reason, have not yet been made.
So I want to get to some of those changes because I'm just a regular person, right? I'm not in law enforcement. I'm not an attorney. I did think at one point I wanted to go to law school, and I was talked out of it. But it just feels like after watching that video and all the videos, not just of the incidents themselves, but even after all these incidents, of the way protesters have been met with police in certain parts of the country, that video of the police car ramming the barricades into protesters in New York, how do you rebuild that trust? I mean, how do you get people to trust police officers again after everything that we've seen over the last couple months? I mean, couple years really since Ferguson, but recently I feel like we've woken up and so many people have watched these videos. Let's start with you, Chief Scott. How do you start rebuilding that trust between officers and the people that they're sworn to protect and serve?
Well, it goes back to the basis of what are the values of the San Francisco Police Department and police departments across the country? Because it really starts there. What are our values? Do we respect people as human beings, number one? Do we respect the sanctity of life? I mean, every solid use of force policy should start there.
Right.
And secondly, are we really walking the talk? I mean, just something as basic as how we talk to people. I mean, by and large, most people in this country it's not going to be the high-profile incident.
Right.
It's going to be the day-to-day incident where they come in contact with a police officer, whether it be on a traffic type of situation, violation, or even just a routine call for service. How are we treating people in those routine calls? How are we treating people at 3 o'clock in the morning when nobody else is watching? It really starts there. Because these high-profile, incidents that are captured by video, and it really, those shape,
of course,
the mindset of many, many people. But there are millions of contacts every year between police and the publics that we serve, and how are we treating them? I can recall before I became a police officer being stopped by an officer, and this was in my home state that I grew up in of Alabama, and I was young college student, 19 years old, a grown man, at least I thought it was. And I remember him repeatedly calling me boy.
The police officer.
The police officer, and how that made me feel. I still remember it this day. To this day, I remember how that made me feel.
How did it make you feel?
It made me feel like I was less than a person, less than a man. I was a boy. And in the South, calling a grown black man a boy meant something. It meant that you were less than, that you weren't equal to. And so, my takeaway from that experience is...
I'm sorry, can we go back to that for a second?
Yeah.
When that happened, when that officer called you that, what was going through your mind in that moment? And how do you think that might have colored how you interacted with police officers after that?
Well, what was going through my mind is, first of all, let me get out of this situation. Because you don't know what's going to happen next. This was what I've been accused of, was traffic violation, but you don't know what's going to happen later. And mind you, you're talking to a man. When I learned how to drive, my uncle who taught me how to drive used to always tell me, if you get stopped late at night by the police, make sure you keep going until you're in a lighted area where people are around. So this was how my mindset was at that age of my life. So my first thing is let me make sure that this doesn't turn into anything else. So of course I'm yes sir, no sir, and being respectful because that's what I was taught. But I still remember to this day, how that made me feel. So I mean, it goes back to how we respect people. How do we show that we really are this entity that has just the basic common respect for people?
And do you think that's possible?
That is definitely possible. That part is definitely possible because law enforcement policing can be volatile. There's probably always going to be incidents where violence will happen. The question is, number one, just going back to the basics. Sometimes if you mistreat people for something simple, it escalates to those violent situations.
Well, what do you think, Chesa? Do you think it's possible to bounce back from everything that so many people have seen? Obviously, certain communities, in particular black communities, have had interactions with police over decades and decades that have eroded that trust. But do you feel like we can bounce back from everything that's happened and as a society trust police after everything we've seen?
So I want to go back to something you said at the beginning of the conversation, Manny, which is that words matter.
Yes.
And so I want to interrogate the question that you put to us, which is rebuild trust. I think, and I know from many conversations with many people in San Francisco and beyond, that there are lots of communities in this country that don't feel they've ever had trust with law enforcement. Now, I'm not just saying police, it's true with district attorneys' offices as well.
Right.
And so for some folks, it's a question of rebuilding trust. And for many others, it's a question of building trust, of establishing trust. And when you have generation after generation, particularly of young black men who have had experiences like the one that Chief Scott just described, and who have been taught as a result of those experiences that they've had or that their father or their uncle or their brother has had, that they need to be scared of any interaction with police.
Right.
It does tremendous damage to the work that I know Chief Scott and I aspire to do in keeping this community safe.
So
it makes it impossible.
So what do we do then? What's the next? I mean, how do we? If there are generations of people and there's whole swaths of people in our cities, in our country, that start from a base level is do not trust these people, and often for good reason. How do you maintain the institution, allow them to do their job, and create an environment where they can work together, especially after everything that we've seen?
So I'm going to give you three really specific answers, but each one of them in and of itself needs to be unpacked and developed, and there's many parts to accomplishing these three goals.
Okay.
First is transparency, second is accountability, and the third is creativity. And what I mean by creativity is we need to be creative about the role police play in our neighborhoods and what we ask police to do. Because the kinds of situations that do the most damage both to individual members of the community and to the trust that we're trying to build, as well as to officers who are trying to do a job that's difficult under difficult circumstances, is when we send police in to handle a situation like a mental health crisis or like a drug overdose, where it distracts police from what I believe should be their core function of preventing and responding to and investigating crimes. And it also puts them in a position where things can easily go wrong in ways that have high stakes.
Right. And you've talked about this, Chief Scott. You're amenable to, the recent announcement from the mayor. Sorry to steal a little mask moment. You're amenable to this idea of officers not having to do every single thing that we've asked officers to do. And I think you said in your interview with Heather Knight, being homeless is not a crime. And it is certainly possible that an armed police officer is probably not necessarily the best person to respond to every 311 call for homeless people. So you're amenable to it. But I guess my question is, what does that process look like? How do we figure out what things the police should no longer be doing and then hand that off to other people?
Well, the data is there. I mean, we have 311 calls. The DA Boudin mentioned that a minute ago about the data exists for us to analyze it. And we can't take forever to do this.
Right.
We also have relationships with many people in our communities that we serve who are experts at what they do. And we have to listen to them.
Yeah.
This idea is not new.
Right.
It's not new.
Right.
It's timely right now, and I think it's this tragic incident really has given us a newfound sense of urgency to really explore these options and be creative, but they're not new. And I think part of what we have to do better, and we have to do much better, is really listen to some of the people that have been talking about this for years. I mean, the will is there, the data is there, the people is there, and I think in our city, the relationships are there. Yeah, we have to put all that together and make it work for positive change, and I think it's very possible. You know, the homeless situation that you just mentioned, and there are others where mental health calls where there's not a crime, there's not anybody's life in jeopardy. You know, those are situations where we have to take a second look and say, well, maybe it's better that a psychologist or a clinician respond to that call.
So who or what would be standing in your way to make these reforms? Because I think you're right. There seems to be a lot of stars aligning right now for some of these reforms to happen, and these aren't new ideas. But I imagine, like any big change, there are going to be people who don't want it to happen. And a lot of people are saying that the police union, the POA, the Police Officers Association, might be very resistant to major changes. And I guess I wanted to ask you the question, do you think they're going to be an impediment to reform?
Well, I don't think so, and I hope not. And I think right now we're at a time where, I mean, the POA, along with the Los Angeles Police Protective League and the San Jose POA, made a joint statement that they are open and willing for reform to happen. And, you know, let's take that take them for their word. But we have to force the issue.
Right.
I mean, we have to force the issue. And to answer your question, it's not going to be simple. I'm not saying that it's going to be simple because we're talking about institutional change across the board, across many departments. But everybody needs to be held accountable for their piece of this equation.
Okay, so let's talk about this. The first ever person we interviewed here in the space was Alicia Garza, who I think we all know who she is. And she brought up this concept of radical imagination, which I love. I love what that means and what it says. And it's the idea that you have to kind of imagine the future that you want, even if it's kind of radical in ideas, and that's how you get to the first stage of building it. So if you two could rebuild our policing system from the ground up, completely start from scratch, and you two held the magic fairy wands to build it up. I'm just imagining you with a fairy wand right now. And you build up the policing system from the ground up. What would it look like and what would it do?
I'm a big believer in the concept that, you know, similar to what Alicia Garza said, that politics is not just the art of making, you know, deals today on today's terms, but actually making possible tomorrow that which we cannot even imagine being possible today. And so when you talk about this reimagination of the police, I think that's the moment in American history we find ourselves in.
Right.
In an ideal world, honestly, I think we'd live in a society where we don't need police, right? Where we would respect each other's rights and rules and regulations, and we wouldn't have to have other people to do that. And that's not real. That's not the real world. That's not the world I expect I'll ever live in. But that's my ideal world. Now, short of that, I would love to live in a world, which frankly in countries as close as England was true in our lifetimes, where most police don't have to carry guns.
Right.
Where that's not necessary. Now, to get there, we need to make sure that guns are off the streets. And the Supreme Court and the Second Amendment and the National Rifle Association make it really difficult. And how am I going to say to Chief Scott, let's talk about your officers not carrying guns when we know how many guns are on the streets of San Francisco? That's not real either.
Right.
But that's the direction. If we're going to be radical in our imagination, if we're going to be creative in our approach, if we're going to be forward-looking, that's the society we want to build, where people don't need to carry guns to feel safe.
What do you think, Chief Scott? Magical wand, you could rebuild, ground zero, day one, you're rebuilding the police force and what it does from the first day. What does it look like and what does it do?
The first thing is collaborative government has to exist for that scenario to play out where there's less reliance on police. I mean, when I say collaborative, I mean collaborative. I mean, we have departments that do great work.
Right.
What sometimes I think where we fall short is collaboration. So that has to happen first and foremost. And from policing start, I mean, our role in society was really the prevention of crime, the absence of crime, not reacting to crime when crime occurs. But in order for that to happen, some things have to happen. Communities have to be healthier and stronger and more resilient. We have to, I mean, it touches on a lot of other social issues, and I don't want to cast shade on anybody else's lane here, but the reality is when we have the educational gaps and disparities, look, there's data, much data out there that shows that people who usually find their way into the criminal justice system, there's usually educational gaps, deficiencies, dropout rates that are astronomical, those type of things exist. So we also have to address those issues at the same time. Yeah, they don't directly impact policing, but yet they do. Because we know that it's a real tangible issue that we have to address at the same time. So the other part of this is really having a police department that, as basic as this sounds, it's easier said than done, is truly a part of the community rather than policing a community, because there's a difference. You know, true community policing, you're a part of that community. You know who's in that community. And that makes all the difference in the world. And it's something that we try to aspire to in this city.
Right.
But it's easier said than done.
Being a part of the community and actually integrated in it.
Integrated in the community as a part. I mean, to rely on the police to be the keepers of peace in a community in a democratic society, I think is just, it's a lofty goal that we have not yet achieved.
So that's our radical imagination. We put her out there. She's there. The seed has been planted. And we're going to water her, and she's just going to grow, hopefully, together, okay? So let's talk about this relationship right here, the two of you. There's the two of you right here in San Francisco, but I want to also take it kind of broader and ask, what do you feel like is the ideal relationship between a district attorney and a chief of police to make that vision actually come true?
We have to be cooperative and communicative, but we also have to be independent and detached. And I'm not saying that specifically with regard to the police chief, but you mentioned police unions, and I have to respectfully disagree with Chief Scott's view of the police unions. Even as they're paying lip service to reform in this moment, where they have no choice but to do that, they're quietly funding effort to undo Proposition 47. And
What's that?
Proposition 47 is a proposition which passed statewide and which reduced a large number of nonviolent drug and property crimes from felonies to misdemeanors.
And why are they fighting it?
Because it takes power away from them and because it decreases the punitive power of the criminal justice system. And to me, if you're serious about reform, then put your money where your mouth is. Don't just do a press release saying we care about reform. Actually support reform, or at the very least stop fighting against it. But we have seen police unions. Prop 47 is one example. We have a new law that just took effect, Senate Bill 1421, and police unions have been at the forefront. That law is aimed at increasing transparency. Remember I said transparency, accountability, and creativity. Well, we have no transparency in the state of California with regard to police officer personnel files. And we don't know who's on our streets.
And 1 second, why is that, Chief Scott? I mean, it seems like something that should be readily available. I mean, these are public servants. I mean, why is that being fought against, and why would that be an issue for police officers?
Well, I don't know that it's, not everybody sees this issue the same way, and I don't dispute what the DA is saying about police unions fighting against that. The process in terms of the California Peace Officers Bill of Rights has been long-standing, and here's again change.
Right.
Senate Bill 1421 was aimed to ensure that transparency, particularly when it came to officer-involved shootings, incidents where officers became involved in use of forces that had great bodily injury, officers that became involved in sexual assaults and dishonesty type of situations, that there's transparency on those issues. I, for one, see that as a good thing.
So you support it?
I see it as a good thing.
But other people seem to not support it.
Police unions have fought against it, and it's been virtually impossible, even for district attorneys' offices, but also for the media or the public at large to get access to these records. And the issue is this. You talk about building trust. You talk about having a relationship that's productive and collaborative and promotes public safety. How can people trust police if they don't know if the person who's showing up at their door when someone calls the police has a history of racial profiling, excessive force, misconduct, and what have you. That's why we need transparency. It's why we need accountability, and it's why we need to make sure that every single police officer, and that the public knows that every single police officer is held to the highest standards. Most of them are. We've got a great police force by and large in San Francisco. And the problem is, I mean, obviously there's room for improvement. I know that. We all know that. But look, I read a report this morning, I think it was, about tear gas in response to the George Floyd protests.
Right. Which we didn't use here at all in San Francisco.
And that's the point. 98 American cities use tear gas in volumes that have never been matched since the late 1960s and early 1970s.
Wow.
It's a watershed moment in our lifetimes, and San Francisco avoided using tear gas.
And what is it about our police force, your police force, that led to us being one of the few cities in the country that didn't use tear gas?
Well, it goes back to what I said earlier. Culture. You know, organizations are driven by culture. What is the culture of the San Francisco Police Department? What do we aspire to be? We aspire to be a police department who respects the sanctity of life, number one, and my instructions to our command staff and our command staff instructions to our officers started there. This is about protecting life, and so that's where we started. The second thing is respect. I mean, 2.5 years ago, we had an internal and an external work group, and our strategy statement is safety with respect. Now, some people are like, oh, that's just a you know, some coin phrase. It's not.
Right.
Respect means something, and I go back to being called a boy, you know, when I was 19 years old or so. Respect means something, and that, if we're not respecting people, you've already lost the game. So our philosophy in these protests, number one, our police department hadn't used tear gas. I don't know when the last time we used tear gas, you know, and in a crowd situation. It's just not, you know, it's not the right thing to do, particularly for a peaceful crowd. So we have values internally that drive us, and not to say that other departments don't. I mean, I don't know what their values are, but what I can say is what's right for the people in this city in terms of how we aspire to police them, and that's in a respectful way that respects them as human beings, that respects, you know, protecting life, and really not. And when it comes to protests, let me just say this too, because I have to say this because of where I come from. I wouldn't be sitting here if it weren't for protests. You know, I would not be in this chair right now speaking to you as the chief of police if my family back in Birmingham, Alabama in the 60s didn't get subjected to having dogs sicked on them and fire hoses sprayed on them. And, you know, those were my flesh and blood out there in those protests. I would not be sitting here. Yeah, the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing where 4 little girls got murdered. 3 of those girls were students of my father-in-law. I mean, so I understand as the leader of this organization, I understand what that means. So yeah, we're going to respect the rights of protesters, and even, you know, enforcing a curfew. I know there were a lot of people who didn't agree with that. Our philosophy was really about not having anybody lose their lives,
so
more than anything else.
It sounds like leadership is really important in this. I do want to push back a little bit on one aspect of that, because I feel like I have to, and I feel like there's been an uproar in our city recently about it. And it's this shooting of Jessica Williams in the Tenderloin in 2013, I think it was. And I don't want to get into like what happened exactly and all the reports and the accountability. What I want to get at is, as a layperson, right? I'm just a regular person, right? And I've been trying to prepare my head off for this conversation. It just seems like oftentimes when something really bad happens, the punishment that's metered out to a police officer is a lot smaller or disproportionately smaller than you might expect. I mean, this officer, what happened resulted in a woman's life being lost, and he got 45 days no pay. And it's like, if anyone else did something and someone died, you'd get a lot more than 45 days with no pay. So do you feel like the system of punishment for when something bad happens in a police officer, with a police officer involved shooting, that system of accountability isn't working well and needs to be addressed and fixed?
Absolutely, it needs to be addressed and work better. But I'm going to go back to something that I firmly agree with that the district attorney said: transparency. Transparency is a huge step toward accountability. And if the Senate Bill 1421, which was now incorporated into the Penal Code Section 832.7, as of January 1st, 2019, those cases now are fully transparent. So the public gets to see, everything when it comes to those type of cases. When Miss Williams lost her life at the hands of San Francisco Police, this department, my department, our department, that law didn't exist. And not to say that, I won't sit here and say, decisions would have been different because of that, but what I will say is when there's transparency, with that comes accountability. Because the public actually gets to see all the facts, and the public gets to make its own judgment on whether that decision was right or not right. And that's the road to the accountability that we're talking about. So that's why I am in favor of it. We all should be held accountable, but the public has a right to see it. So these decisions that used to be made by law in the cloak of closed room, closed session type of environments, now all this information will be available for the public to see, and I think it's a huge step in the right direction. And I think the accountability piece will improve as transparency is real.
But I get the accountability thing, Chief Scott, but my question is, that doesn't seem like a very harsh punishment for killing someone. You know what I mean? So I hear that with greater transparency, there'll be greater accountability, but still, why is it that the punishment seems so light when something as grave as a death happened?
Because a life was lost. I mean, that is in and of itself shocking when a life is lost. And I invite anybody, I mean, that report, I don't know if all of it, because 1421, some of the files are so big, it's getting released.
Yeah.
It's called a rolling release. So I don't know if all the files are out. But what I will say is when a life is lost, people expect, particularly if they believe that it's not just, that it's not justified, they expect to see accountability.
Yeah.
So my ask is this: when that information, a lot of it is out there, people have to read the case, really read the case, just like we have in others, and determine whether it's just or not.
Okay.
Because there's the decision on that case was a lot of the procedural issues that were brought up in that case were part of the issue. The death itself is a separate adjudication from a lot of the other things that this 45-day punishment was based on. So I would invite people to read the case.
Okay.
And then,
Thank you, Chief Scott. I feel like I have to ask you about it.
Sure,
It is important to talk about it.
Absolutely.
Okay, one thing with you on this question of working together and what does that ideal relationship look like? I'm not saying that this is something that San Francisco District Attorney's Office has an issue with, but I was listening to the Daily podcast, and it was about, police accountability, why it's so hard. And one of the things that the New York Times reporter said was there's this whole culture of, in order to get ahead as a district attorney, you have to have a high rate of convictions. And if you convict a cop of a crime, the cops are not going to work with you to get your convictions, and it could limit your career trajectory. Which to me seems like a big problem in a DA's office if you don't want to hurt your relationship with the cops. So if you ever get a case where you need to convict a cop, you're not going to convict him because you want to get ahead in your career. So is that actually a problem? Like, is that happening in DA offices? And if it is, how do we fix that so if there is a case where a cop comes to be convicted, you don't have to choose between your career and the case in front of you?
Yes, it's a problem, and I want to talk about 3 ways that I think you fix it. So the first is we need to recognize that even when we're dealing with cases that have nothing to do with police being investigated for potential criminal activity, rewarding, evaluating, and promoting district attorneys based on things like conviction rate or length of sentence is simply disconnected from the priorities that we as a community have. It does not have anything to do with public safety, with recidivism, with rehabilitation, or with healing for victims of crime. So we need to start evaluating and incentivizing our staff using metrics that relate to all of those things. The second point is that this is a conflict that manifests not only with individual cases, but with offices and elections of district attorneys. What I mean by that is, in most races in this country, if you're running for district attorney, the single most valuable endorsement you can get is from a local police union. Comes with donations to your campaign. It comes with lots of political support.
Yeah.
And that relationship, that financial and political relationship between elected DAs and local law enforcement unions, creates at a minimum the appearance of a conflict of interest in any case where we might be asked to investigate police misconduct. And it's for that reason that I joined together a couple weeks ago with two other elected DAs in California and a former elected DA from San Francisco to take a pledge never to accept direct donations from police unions and never to accept or seek an endorsement from a police union. Not because we want to silence police unions. They're going to have the ability to spend as much money as they want through independent expenditures. But because we need to have a separation, a political and a financial firewall.
From the police unions and the district attorneys.
Exactly. And the third thing that I want to mention, which is really important, is that we need to have independent teams within our DA offices, as I do, an independent investigation bureau that is staffed by lawyers and investigators whose full-time job is to investigate cases of police use of force or other misconduct. Those lawyers are there for that purpose. So it's not going to distract from or interfere with their career path. Other district attorneys' offices should follow suit. And we have a MOU, a memorandum of understanding with the police department, where if there's an officer-involved shooting, Chief Scott's team notifies my team, and we send investigators out 24/7 to respond to the scene, to take notes, to document images, to speak with witnesses, to do our own independent investigation that they can then use as a basis for making a recommendation to me about whether we file charges or not. Other DA's offices should do the same thing.
Okay. We only have a couple minutes left. We've got about 6 minutes left, so I'm going to try to close it off with two really tough questions. Of course, I ended with the tough ones, and we're a little short on time.
Okay.
And for those of you who are tuning in, immediately after this, we're going to go to the break room, so look out for that. The conversation does not end at 7 o'clock, and more on that in a couple of minutes. So two tough questions to end this. First, Chief Scott, it seems like so much of this is a white cop against a black man. And it leads you to ask the question, are racist individuals attracted to the job of being a police officer almost? And if, is racism a problem in the police force? And is there something about being a police officer that's bringing in people that have a problem with black men and seem to have some kind of desire to hurt them?
I don't believe there's something about the job that does that. I do believe that there are racist police officers throughout this country. And I don't know that, and I don't believe that it's the nature of policing that does that, but I do think that with our hiring practices, with who we vet to do this job, we have to do everything that we can to root that out. And I know, the mayor has an initiative, the vice president of the police commission announced an initiative a couple of weeks ago to do just that in our city. The fact of the matter is the majority of police officers in this country are still white males, and white males have to be a part of this solution, and many are part of this solution. And those folks that are racist or that in them, they need to go. Quite frankly, the question is how do we detect it and how do we root it out? Short of an incident, and even when an incident happens, it's really hard to prove that it's racially motivated. That's where we have to kind of look at historical patterns of just kind of all the things that we talked about, both the district attorney and myself. But it's really hard. I mean, it's not easy.
And I think we're making some news tonight, or at least on the heels of some news on the question of racial bias in the police force. You've brought some books here. Do you want to tell us about the announcement that was made today and something that our police force is doing to address the issue of racial bias?
Sure. And so I'll talk about my books, but I want to talk about how we got to this. And it goes back to something that was said earlier that I said, and I think the district attorney echoed about listening and hearing people that are talking to you. I know the district attorney and I have had these conversations about the release of booking photos. The public defender and I have had, and his staff have had these discussions about the consequences of the releasing of booking photos. And these two books that I brought one of the many great things about our engagement in collaborative reform and the Collaborative Reform Initiative, one of the recommendations spoke to the San Francisco Police Department working with academic partners. Working with those academic partners led me to the authors of these two books. One is Dr. Jack Glaser, and one is Dr. Jennifer Eberhard. Dr. Eberhard is at Stanford, really a nationally, if not world-renowned, PhD level scientist on the science of bias. And the same can be said about Dr. Glaser. So both of these books, Suspect Race and Bias, we've had the good fortune to personally, for me and our department, personally be able to reach out to these two renowned people and ask for their guidance in helping revise our policies on release of booking photos. So what has been talked about in Police Commission and that's being announced is we are restricting the release of booking photos. And really there's only a couple of instances where we will release booking photos, and that's if somebody's in imminent danger and the booking photo is going to help resolve that.
Catch them or resolve
or there's an individual who is at risk for whatever reason, or the person whose booking photo is subject to being released is a imminent threat to the community at large. So it's a big step in the right direction.
So no booking photos.
Right.
We're done with those.
Exactly. So the policy is not out yet. It'll be out here in the very near future. But there's a passage from Dr. Glaser's book that talks about, I put my glasses on, I'll be real quick because I know we're running out of time here, that talks about the harm. And both of the books really address it, but it talks about the harm of illusory correlation, which is basically when you associate a group of people based on a correlation with a member of that group with some type of event. So in this case, African American men mainly, or men of color, being associated with crime.
So I'm glad that you made that announcement. Thank you very much, Chief Scott. The final question goes to you, Chesa, which is, what is the path forward? And where do we go from here? What's the next step?
So I think we need to be careful when we think about moving forward, that we're not simply putting this behind us and carrying on. America has done that in one way or another for centuries. And so these problems of racial bias, of racial discrimination, of government and police brutality continue to resurface in ways that are more visible and often more harmful even than they were 10, 20, 50 years ago. So we need to, when we talk about moving forward, we need to make sure that we're actually addressing our past and looking long and hard in the mirror about how we spend our resources and what our values and priorities are. And do our current allocation of budgets actually address those? I mean, in San Francisco, for example, starting salary for police officers, if you include overtime, is nearly double the starting salary for school teachers. And police have a difficult job. They have a risky job. They should be well compensated for their work. But if we're not investing in our schools, as Chief Scott himself said, that's the best sign of who's going to end up in the criminal justice system down the road. We need to start investing in our communities. We need to start moving forward by thinking long term about what real safety looks like. And it's not just making arrests when a crime is committed. It's not just securing a conviction when someone's been arrested. It has to do with investing in community safety and well-being in ways that many parts of this country have refused to do for communities of color and immigrant communities for far too long.
Well, you two, this has been an illuminating conversation, a difficult one, and I want to thank you both for your humility, because a lot of the questions that we all talked about in the conversation we had was about reflecting on the institutions that at least you two are leading and are a part of. And that's not an easy thing to do. And I know that we find ourselves in a moment of intense reflection, introspection. I know that thinking about this conversation has been something that's weighed heavily on me. But I have faith in our city, and I have faith in both of you, and I have faith in our country. I think that through this, we will see progress, and frankly, I feel lucky to be alive to witness it and be a part of it. So I want to thank you both, the District Attorney of San Francisco, Chesa Boudin, the Chief of Police of San Francisco, Bill Scott, for sharing your stories, sharing your hearts, being open to this, and being willing to walk into these doors and sit together with each other and talk about where we go from here. So thank you both. Thank you all for tuning in. And the next piece of this is what we're calling the break room. So you listened, you waited, You were patient, hopefully you got a drink or something, and now it's time for you all to talk amongst yourselves. So we've had a lot of people register for this conversation, and we really want to give you the opportunity to talk amongst yourselves. So if you go to tinyurl.com/Manny's Break Room, that, if you can hear me through my mask, is tinyurl.com/Manny's Break Room, you will be entered into a Zoom conversation with break rooms where there will be facilitators waiting to guide you in a conversation with other people about what you just heard, what you learned, and also what you might want to do about it. So the next step of this Manny's Live process and experience is actually about you. So please go to tinyurl.com/Manny's Break Room in a minute or two. Give me a second so I can get ready. And we'll see you in the break room. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in. And we'll see you on Thursday at 6 p.m. for our next Manny's Live conversation with Supervisor Shaman Walton and the Executive Director of the Human Rights Commission, Cheryl Davis, to talk about this question of redirecting funds from the San Francisco Police Department. That'll be Thursday at 6 o'clock to have a conversation with them and many more conversations in the future. Thank you very much again and have a good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.